All right, folks, we're going to begin our reading of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. We'll start with chapter 1, which is called The Story of a Door. So, you can get down here through all this background information. You're welcome to read along or to just listen up. I'm going to project the story on, obviously. Here we go. The Story of a Door. So, Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something, indeed, which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in the silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. All right, so we're getting a description of, I guess, the central figure of the story, Mr. Utterson. He's a lawyer, so we know that he's an educated man. He's a man of sort of like means. But his description, I think, is interesting. He's rugged. He never smiles. He's cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse. He doesn't talk very much, and when he does, he's sort of awkward. Backward in sentiment. The idea here is, if you read any Victorian literature, emotion was much more common in the Victorian era. It was very common for people to be, especially men, to be much more emotional than they're allowed to be in modern times. I think that's because in like the 1930s, John Wayne curb stomped emotion, and it became weird for men to be emotional. I think it's had a long history of negative effects. But whatever, I'm not assessing modern society. I'm reading a story. So while a lot of characters in Jekyll and Hyde are going to be very outwardly emotional, they're going to project their emotions. Utterson is not. He's sort of opposite of the Victorian normal, and I think that's important. But it says he's lean, long, so he's thin. He's tall, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. So it's important that despite the fact that he's got a very emotionless personality, he's a likable guy, right? At friendly meetings and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye. And he's likable because there's something about him that is his humanity shows clearly through. And it's something that he doesn't talk a lot about, but that you can see in the acts of his life. So the idea here is that, it's not important what people say, it's what they do. Actions speak louder than words. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages. He likes wine, but if he's drinking alone, he's going to drink gin because it's gross. I think that says something about his... he doesn't drink wine because it tastes good when he's alone. He doesn't want to get drunk on his own. Anyway, and though he enjoyed the theater, he had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than reprove. I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chamber, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanor. This is also important background information on him as well. He is non-judgmental. He's not going to tell you how to behave or how to live your life. And because of that, he can tolerate all kinds of behaviors, and he ends up being the last respectable person in the lives of people who are making bad choices, going down into drugs or alcohol or whatever. And he never changes the way he behaves to them, even though they have changed themselves. So he's a very stable person, but a non-judgmental one. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. This is a simile. They implied no aptness to the object. So the people that he's friends with are people that he encounters every day. And he's just I sympathize with this. I don't go out and make a lot of friends. I become friends with the people who are near me, and that's Mr. Utterson. He's the same way. I'm an introvert. I'm not going out and doing all those kinds of things, but um, I make friends with those who are nearby. I'm already friends with Miss Horn across the hallway. Um, anyway, let's keep going. Uh, Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them on their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, as and counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business, that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. So it's weird to people who observe Utterson, who's so emotionless and stuffy and all of this kind of stuff, that one of his good friends is a man named Mr. Richard Enfield. Enfield is a, quote, man about town. He's young, he's fashionable, he's cheerful, he's good in conversation. But a man about town also has this connotation of somebody who is a bit of, I don't know, a rake, somebody who has a lot of relationships and maybe drinks a little too much and partakes in other pleasures of life that are not necessarily above board. And so these two seem to be very opposite personalities, but they take a walk together every Sunday. It's a long walk. Now, this was a very common thing in Victorian times. These walks were called constitutionals. It was very common for somebody to take a 5 or 10 mile walk once a week as a way to sort of keep up their health. And that's what Enfield and Utterson do together. But I think it's interesting that they never talk, they just walk, and they seem to enjoy each other's unobtrusive company. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still. We're getting good vocab here, so if you need vocab words for anything, there's a ton of them here. And laying out the surplus of their grains and coquetry, so that the shop front stood along a thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Another simile for you. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood, like a fire in a forest, and, with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. So these two are walking down a street, and it's a market street, kind of like Old Town Manassas or Old Town Warrenton or something like that. It's well upkept. Everything is beautiful and well painted and trying to please the eye of the passerby. However, they're going to note the chapter is called The Story of a Door, and here comes the entrance of a door into it. Two doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point, a certain sinister block of building. Look at the. This is personification, right? We're calling a building sinister, like it can have that sort of a. Uh, buildings are inanimate objects. Anyway, a sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recesses and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop under the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the moldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. So the paint's peeling. It's been carved into by kids with knives. It's the kind of place where a tramp or a homeless person would sleep at night. The description of the door itself is very negative. It's noteworthy because we just saw the description of the rest of the street as beautiful, and this door sticks out like a sore thumb, to use a simile. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. Remember, Enfield's very fashionable. He's got like a cane and like spats on his shoes and a top hat, and then there you got Utterson, who's standing next to him, who looks super boring. Let's see. He lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked. And when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed," said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what is that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town." Some place at the end of the world. That's clearly a euphemism, right? Like he is probably coming back from an opium den or a whorehouse or something that he doesn't want to mention. And it's what time? 3 o'clock in the morning. So he's telling a story of this door and what it's connected within his mind. That he says, "Yeah, I was coming home at 3 o'clock in the morning." So he's walking through this part of London. We're having sort of a flashback, and we're going to have a long monologue, a long narration from Enfield here without a lot of interruption. So it's like he's telling an earlier story. Um, where were we? "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps, street after street, and all the folks asleep, street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church." That's sort of an ironic simile, empty as a church. Aren't churches supposed to be full? "Till at last I got into the state of mind when a man listens and listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman." Of course, this is the time period when Jack the Ripper was doing his thing in London, and maybe there's a connection here, but in the story, it's a foggy night in London. There's lights everywhere. He's starting to feel creeped out. It's that sort of classic horror suspense bit going on. "All at once I saw two figures. One, a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another, naturally enough, at the corner." Now, we see this at school, right? Like there's a corner and you're coming from the other direction, two people are coming and you see them coming and then they run into each other. This is exactly what happens. This stumpy little man runs into this little girl. The two ran into one another, naturally enough, at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damn juggernaut. I gave a few holler, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a troop about the screaming child. So these two ran into each other, and the stumpy little man like stamped on the child and then kept going. And Mr. Enfield, the narrator here, grabbed the stumpy little man and dragged him back to where the child is crying on the ground after she's been trampled. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she had been sent put in his appearance. So we get a little bit of backstory. The girl, I guess, was coming back from the doctor. She'd run to the doctors to get the doctor because apparently there was somebody sick at their house and they needed the doctor. And on her way back, she got trampled by the stumpy little man. So we're getting a little bit of backstory here. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to the sawbones. That's a old what word do I want? That's an old word for a doctor. Obviously, it's something about his profession. Now, back in the day, like when you had to have your arm amputated, they had like literally a handsaw and they'd saw it off. And so, but that's the reference that Sawbones makes. It's just a synonym for doctor. Anyway, more frightened, according to the Sawbones, and there you might have supposed would have been an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing, it means hatred, to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turn sick and white with a desire to kill him. Now, this is interesting. Apparently, the stumpy little man is so evil-looking and so horrible that everybody hates him. Now, he trampled on a girl, which is bad. But the doctor, who's super emotionalist and who's also taken a Hippocratic oath to help everybody, Enfield can see that the doctor himself wants to kill this stumpy little man. Which is interesting because the doctor's an unemotional guy. I knew what was on his mind just as he knew what was in mine, and killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. That's an allusion to Greek mythology, if you know what harpies are. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces, and there was a man in the middle. The man in the middle with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened, too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. There's a simile connecting the stumpy little man to Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. So, essentially, they could call the cops on him for trampling this kid. Instead, they decide to get him to pay the family of the girl some money to sort of shut up about it. And they ultimately get him to pay £100, which in modern day is like $100, but back then was a lot more like $1,000 essentially in equivalent money. So it's not a small amount of money. The next thing was to get the money. Nobody carries $1,000 in their wallet on a dark London night, so clearly the stumpy little man didn't have the money. The next thing was to get the money, and where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? Whipped out a key and went in, and presently came back with a matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for the balance on counts, drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it is one of the points of my story. But it was a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that, if it was only genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not in real life walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out with another man's check for close upon £100. So what happens is he goes in, he needs to get this £100 or $1,000, and he comes out with essentially the equivalent of a $100 bill and a check for $900 that's not signed by him. It's signed by somebody else. Now, Enfield's not going to say the name of the other person because he's not rude enough to get into other people's business, but he's like, hey, it's a well-known person. So it would be the equivalent of, I don't know, there's some stumpy little man who tramples a little girl in the middle of the night, and you get him to pay the girl's family $1,000, and he goes to some ugly door, goes in, comes out with $100 bill and a check signed by Dr. Mintz, the principal of the school, for the rest of the money. And that's weird because she's respectable, and there's no way she'd be involved with this stumpy little man, right? So that's what's going on here. He says, in real life, you don't go into a door at 3 o'clock in the morning, come out with $100 and a check signed by somebody else for the rest of the money. That's just weird. And so he doesn't believe it. He thinks it's a forgery. So I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not in real life walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out with another man's check for close upon £100. But he was quite easy in sneering. Set your mind at rest, says he. I will stay with you till the bank's open and cash the cheque myself. So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. And the next day, when we had breakfasted, we went in a body to the bank. I gave it in the cheque myself, and I said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. Tut, tut, that's sort of Mr. Utterson's catchphrase, said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr. Enfield. Yes, it's a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque was the very pink of the properties, celebrated too. And what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call the place, with the door in consequence. Though even that, you know, is far from explaining all, he added, and with the words fell into a vein of musing. So he stops talking and is thinking for a bit. So Enfield assumes that the stumpy little man had something on the gentleman who signed the check and is blackmailing him into paying him money. Um, from this, he was recalled by Mr. Utterson asking rather suddenly, "And you don't know if the drawer of the check lives there?" "A likely place, isn't it?" returned Mr. Enfield. "But I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And you never asked about the place with the door?" said Mr. Utterson. "No, sir, I had a delicacy," was the reply. "I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the Day of Judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. That's another simile. You sit quietly on top of a hill, and away the stone goes, starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine, the more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask." So Enfield's like, "I never asked about it because I didn't want to start an avalanche of questions, and then somebody ends up getting hurt. Best not to ask these kinds of questions." "A very good rule, too," said the lawyer. "But I have studied the place for myself," continued Mr. Enfield. "It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one. But once in a great while, the gentleman of my adventure," meaning the stumpy little man, "there are 3 windows looking out on the court from the first floor, none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there is a chimney, which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about the court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins." The pair walked on again for some while in silence, and then, "Enfield," said Mr. Utterson, "that's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is," returned Enfield. "But for all that," continued the lawyer, "there is one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of the man who walked over the child." "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man by the name of Hyde." "Hm," said Mr. Utterson. "What sort of man is he to see?" "He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong about his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary-looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him, and it's not for want of memory, for I declare that I can see him at this moment." So, interestingly, this Mr. Hyde, the stumpy little man who trampled a girl, he's very normal-looking. He's very... but there's something about him that feels deformed, like there's a deformation there, but you can't see it. You can't put your finger on it. And certainly anybody who looks at him, you look at the women, you look at the doctor, you look at Enfield, they feel an almost immediate feeling of hatred for him. And that's interesting. Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence, obviously under a weight of consideration. "You are sure he used a key?" he inquired at last. "My dear sir," began Enfield, surprised out of himself. "Yes, I know," said Utterson. "I know it must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it is because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home. If you have been inexact at any point, you had better correct it." So it turns out that Utterson knows the person who signed the check, apparently, somehow. And he wants to make sure that his friend didn't exaggerate any part of the story. "I think you might have warned me," returned the other with a touch of sullenness, "but I have been pedantically exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he still has it. I saw him use it not a week ago." Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but never said a word, and the young man presently resumed. "Here's another lesson to say nothing," said he. "I am ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain never to refer to this again." "With all my heart," said the lawyer. "I shake hands on that, Richard." That's the end of the chapter. So we get a story of a stumpy little man who tramples a girl and then pays for it with another man's money, and who comes and goes by this door whenever he seems to feel like it with a key. And everybody hates him on sight. So this is sort of the interesting beginning of the story. Our next chapter is called "The Search for Mr. Hyde." I mean, this is kind of funny. Mr. Hyde, like he's hiding and we've got to go search for him. Oh, that's very funny, Stevenson, very funny. All right, I'm going to stop here. If you have any questions, let me know. But that's the end of our first chapter.